There exists in the clinical literature of Carl Jung a peculiar observation that has been systematically overlooked by modern sleep medicine. Jung documented patients who arrived at his practice not with complaints of depression or anxiety in the conventional sense, but with a specific symptom that defied medical explanation. They could not sleep. Not occasionally, not due to stress or caffeine, but persistently, as though some force within their psyche had deliberately removed their capacity for rest. Before we proceed, this must be stated with absolute clarity. What follows is an exploration of Jung's symbolic and psychological framework for understanding sleeplessness as it relates to individuation and the confrontation with unconscious material. This is not medical advice. Clinical insomnia is a serious condition requiring proper medical evaluation. What Jung observed, however, was something distinct from pathology. He was documenting a psychological phenomenon that occurred during profound identity transformation. In his work, Psychology of the Unconscious, Jung developed what he called the concept of the night sea journey, drawing from ancient mythology to describe the descent into unconscious material. This was not metaphor for Jung. It was clinical reality. He observed that certain patients experience sleeplessness not as a disorder to be cured, but as a necessary passage through which the psyche demanded attention. The removal of sleep, in these cases, functioned as a protective mechanism in reverse. Rather than the unconscious protecting consciousness through the veil of sleep and dreams, it was forcing consciousness to remain awake, to bear witness to material that could no longer be ignored. Jung's translator, Beatrice Hinckel, wrote in her introduction that Jung had plunged boldly into the treacherous sea of mythology and folklore, applying the same scientific method of psychological analysis to ancient material that was applied to the modern mind. What he discovered was that humanity across all ages shared common patterns of psychological transformation, patterns that expressed themselves through symbols. Sleep itself, Jung recognized, functioned as one of these fundamental symbols. It represented the nightly death and rebirth cycle, the temporary dissolution of ego consciousness that allowed the unconscious to process and integrate experience through dreams. But what happened when someone could not complete this cycle? What did it mean when the psyche refused to allow this symbolic death? Jung's clinical documentation revealed something extraordinary. The patients who could not sleep were not merely suffering from overactive minds or biochemical imbalances, though these factors might be present. They were undergoing what he would later term a confrontation with the shadow, that aspect of the personality containing all the elements the conscious mind had rejected, repressed, or failed to integrate. In Psychology of the Unconscious, Jung noted that the mechanism of repression operated as nature's protection against painful feelings caused by unpleasant and unacceptable experiences and thoughts, the recognition of one's egoistic nature, and the often quite unbearable conflict between weaknesses and feelings of idealism. During waking hours, the persona, that social mask Jung identified as distinct from the true self, maintained its structure through constant reinforcement. But at night, when the demands of external reality ceased and the ego's defenses weakened, the repressed material surged forward. For most individuals, this material expressed itself through dreams, those symbolic productions Jung described as being concerned with the problem of life most pressing at the time. Dreams allowed the unconscious to communicate in veiled, symbolic form, providing expression and fulfillment of unrealized wishes or desires without threatening the ego's stability. But in cases of profound psychological transformation, the dream mechanism itself became insufficient. The unconscious required more than symbolic expression during sleep. It demanded conscious confrontation. Jung observed that this sleeplessness appeared at specific junctures in psychological development. It was not random. It emerged when what he called the infantile aspects of the personality, those emotional patterns established in early life and carried unconsciously into adulthood, could no longer sustain the individual's development. Hinkle noted in her translation that Jung discovered through his investigations that the parental influence on individuals was paramount not only for children but for adults as well. That the entire direction of lives was largely determined quite unconsciously by these early associations, and that although adults, the emotional side of their nature remained infantile in type. When the time arrived for these infantile patterns to dissolve, when the old identity structure could no longer contain the emerging self, sleep became impossible. Why? Because sleep represented surrender. It represented the temporary death of consciousness, and the psyche undergoing transformation was already in the process of a much more profound death. The old self was dying, and it was resisting with every mechanism available. To sleep would be to die completely, to release control, to allow the transformation to proceed without the ego's supervision. The terror was not irrational. It was the accurate perception that what would awaken might not be the same identity that closed its eyes. Jung himself experienced this phenomenon during his own confrontation with the unconscious, that period following his break with Freud, when he descended into what he later recognized as a necessary psychological crisis. His documentation of this period, though published much later, revealed nights of profound wakefulness during which he engaged with unconscious material that would have been unbearable in any other state. This was not insomnia as pathology. This was the psyche's demand for conscious participation in its own transformation. The clinical presentation of these patients revealed consistent patterns. They described not merely an inability to fall asleep, but a sensation that sleep had become dangerous. Some reported feeling that if they surrendered to sleep, they would not wake as themselves. Others experienced the night hours as a kind of purgatory, during which thoughts and feelings they had successfully avoided during daylight hours pressed forward with undeniable force. Jung recognized these as symptoms not of disorder, but of the individuation process demanding attention. In his framework, individuation represented the psychological process by which a person becomes a psychological individual, an indivisible unity or whole. But this process required the integration of unconscious material, particularly the shadow. The shadow contained not only negative or unacceptable traits, but also undeveloped potential, capacities and aspects of personality that had been rejected because they conflicted with the persona's requirements. During the day, the persona's structure held firm. At night, with defenses lowered, the shadow emerged. For the sleepless, this emergence was not gentle. Jung documented that when the ego's resistances were strong, when the conscious personality fought against the necessary dissolution of outdated identity structures, the unconscious escalated its demands. Sleeplessness was one such escalation. It forced the individual into a liminal state, neither fully conscious nor able to access the unconscious through dreams. This state, while profoundly uncomfortable, served a function. It prevented the individual from continuing to avoid the confrontation that was necessary for psychological development. Jung's method for working with such patients was not to prescribe sleep aids or attempt to force rest through external means. Instead, he encouraged what he termed active imagination, a technique through which the individual could consciously engage with unconscious material. Rather than fighting the wakefulness, patients were instructed to use these hours productively, to dialogue with the images, thoughts, and feelings that arose. This was not meditation or relaxation. This was direct confrontation with the psyche's demands. Through this process, Jung observed a consistent pattern. As patients began to acknowledge and integrate the shadow material, as they allowed the old identity structures to dissolve and new configurations to emerge, sleep gradually returned. But it returned changed. The quality of sleep post-integration was different from pre-crisis sleep. It was deeper, more restorative, and accompanied by dreams that reflected a new relationship between consciousness and the unconscious. The individual had died symbolically and been reborn, and sleep resumed its function as the nightly rehearsal of this death and rebirth cycle. Jung's ultimate discovery, documented across decades of clinical practice, was that sleeplessness during profound psychological transformation was not a symptom to be suppressed, but a process to be honored. The psyche knew what it was doing. When it removed sleep, it was demanding that consciousness participate fully in its own transformation, that the individual bear witness to the death of the old self rather than sleep through it unconsciously. The alchemists of medieval Europe, whose symbolic language Jung spent decades decoding, possessed a technical term that maps precisely onto what occurs during transformative insomnia. They called it the nigredo, the blackening, the first and most terrible stage of the great work. In their manuscripts, illustrated with images of decomposition and dissolution, the nigredo represented the necessary putrefaction of base matter before any transmutation could occur. Jung recognized in these alchemical texts not primitive chemistry but sophisticated psychological metaphor. The alchemists were documenting the same process he observed in his patients, the same process he endured himself during his own confrontation with the unconscious. In Psychology of the Unconscious, Jung writes of the libido, that psychic energy which animates human life and its transformations. He understood that this energy does not simply flow in one direction but undergoes profound metamorphoses, what he termed the transformations and symbolisms of the libido. During periods of intense psychological change, this energy withdraws from its previous objects and investments. The world that once held meaning suddenly feels hollow because the libido has retracted inward, preparing for a fundamental reorganization. This withdrawal creates the void, that peculiar emptiness that accompanies transformative insomnia. You are not depressed in the clinical sense. You are in the nigredo, the blackening, the dissolution phase where the old structures of meaning must decompose completely before new forms can crystallize. The sleepless hours become, in this framework, the alchemical vessel itself, the sealed container in which the transformation must occur. Jung observed that patients who fought against this process, who demanded immediate relief through sedation or distraction, often prolonged their suffering indefinitely. They were attempting to interrupt the natural psychological process, like trying to halt metamorphosis halfway through. The caterpillar cannot return to being a caterpillar once dissolution has begun, and yet it cannot force itself to become a butterfly through will alone. It must endure the liquefaction, the formless state, the nigredo. What makes this period so unbearable is not merely the absence of sleep, but the presence of something else. The unconscious, no longer content to communicate through dreams alone, begins to intrude into waking consciousness. Jung developed a technique specifically for working with this phenomenon, what he called active imagination. Rather than fighting the sleepless hours, rather than lying in bed struggling to lose consciousness, the individual engages directly with the unconscious material that is preventing sleep. This is not the passive reception of dreams, but an active dialogue with the figures and forces emerging from the depths. In his own writings, Jung describes this process with remarkable candor. He speaks of how, during his own period of confrontation with the unconscious following his break with Freud, he would spend hours in active imagination, allowing figures to emerge and speak, permitting the unconscious to express itself through image and symbol. These were not hallucinations in any pathological sense, but rather what he termed waking dreams, a state in which consciousness remains present while the unconscious is given voice and form. For patients experiencing transformative insomnia, Jung recommended this same approach. Do not fight the wakefulness. Use it. The psyche has removed sleep for a reason. It is demanding that you participate consciously in what is trying to emerge. The clinical literature contains numerous case studies of patients who, following this approach, discovered that their insomnia was not random suffering, but a highly structured process. One patient, a professional man in his 40s, had maintained a successful career through rigid control and rational planning. When his insomnia began, he experienced it as a complete breakdown of his carefully constructed life. Jung's analysis revealed something different. The man's unconscious was rejecting the one-sided development of his conscious personality. His entire identity had been built on intellectual achievement and emotional suppression. The sleepless nights were not attacking him. They were dismantling a psychological structure that had become a prison. Through active imagination during these wakeful hours, the patient began to encounter aspects of himself he had systematically excluded. Emotions he considered weak or unprofessional. Creative impulses he had dismissed as impractical. A capacity for relationship he had sacrificed to ambition. These were not abstract concepts but living presences in his inner world, what Jung termed autonomous complexes. They had their own energy, their own agenda, and they were demanding recognition. The insomnia would not relent until he granted them audience. This brings us to a critical distinction Jung made between pathological insomnia and transformative sleeplessness. The former results from anxiety, rumination, physical illness, or environmental factors. It responds to conventional treatment and does not carry the symbolic weight of psychological transformation. The latter, however, appears during what Jung called the individuation process, that lifelong development towards psychological wholeness. It coincides with specific life transitions, periods when the old adaptation to life no longer functions, when the persona, that social mask we wear, no longer fits the growing self beneath it. Jung observed that this transformative insomnia often appeared in the second half of life, what he termed the afternoon of life, when individuals could no longer live by the values and goals that sustained them in youth. A successful career no longer provides meaning. Accumulated achievements feel strangely empty. Relationships based on projection and unconscious needs begin to collapse. This is not depression, though it may resemble it superficially. This is the psyche's refusal to continue investing energy in structures that no longer serve the individual's development. And sleep, that nightly surrender of ego consciousness, becomes impossible because the ego is clinging desperately to its old identity, terrified of the death that transformation requires. In the Jungian framework, sleep itself carries profound symbolic significance. Each night we die symbolically, releasing conscious control, allowing the ego to dissolve into unconsciousness. Each morning we are reborn, reconstituting the ego, returning to the world. This is why sleep disturbances during major life transitions are so common. The individual is being asked to undergo a more permanent death and rebirth, not the temporary nightly cycle, but a fundamental transformation of identity. The old self must die completely, and some part of us knows this, resists this, fights against this dissolution with every defense mechanism available. Jung documented his own experience of this process with remarkable honesty. Following his break with Freud in 1912, Jung entered a period he later described as his confrontation with the unconscious. He experienced profound disorientation, disturbing visions, and yes, significant sleep disturbances. He did not pathologize this experience or seek to suppress it through medication. Instead, he engaged with it, documented it, allowed it to unfold. From this personal descent into the unconscious emerged the core concepts of analytical psychology: the collective unconscious, the archetypes, the process of individuation itself. His sleeplessness was not a symptom of illness, but a symptom of transformation, a sign that his psyche was undergoing a fundamental reorganization. The productive function of insomnia during individuation cannot be overstated. When sleep is removed, consciousness is forced to remain present during hours normally surrendered to the unconscious. This creates a unique psychological state, a liminal zone between waking and sleeping, where the boundary between conscious and unconscious becomes permeable. Material that would normally express itself only in dreams now becomes accessible to waking consciousness. The individual can dialogue with it, question it, integrate it in ways impossible during either normal waking life or ordinary dreaming. Jung's technique of active imagination exploits this liminal state deliberately. The patient, lying awake at 3 in the morning, does not fight to sleep. Instead, they adopt a meditative stance, allowing images to arise spontaneously from the unconscious. A figure appears. Rather than dismissing it as mere imagination, the patient engages with it, asks it questions, allows it to speak. What emerges is often astonishing. The unconscious, given this opportunity, reveals its own perspective, its own needs, its own wisdom. Patients discover that their insomnia is not meaningless suffering, but a communication from depths they have ignored for decades. One patient, a woman in her 50s, encountered during active imagination a child version of herself, perhaps 7 or 8 years old. This child was weeping, inconsolable. Through dialogue, the patient discovered that this child represented aspects of her own nature she had abandoned in order to meet her family's expectations, to build a successful career, to maintain a respectable marriage. The child was not a memory but a living presence in her psyche, and it was demanding acknowledgement. The insomnia would not cease until this abandoned self was recognized, mourned, and integrated into her current personality. This is the work the sleepless hours were demanding. The return of natural sleep, Jung observed, occurs not when the individual conquers their insomnia through force of will, but when the psychological work is complete. Sleep returns as a gift, not an achievement. It signals that the unconscious has been heard, that the necessary transformation has occurred, that the new self has been born. But this new self is fundamentally different from what preceded it. Patients who successfully navigate transformative insomnia report a changed relationship not only with sleep, but with consciousness itself. They no longer fear the unconscious. They have learned to dialogue with it, to respect its autonomy, to recognize its wisdom. This transformed relationship produces what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to mediate between conscious and unconscious, to create new symbols and meanings that unite previously opposing forces. The individual who emerges from the nigredo is not the person who entered it. They have died and been reborn, not metaphorically but psychologically. Their values have shifted. Their relationships have reorganized around more authentic foundations. Their sense of meaning derives from internal sources rather than external validation. Jung emphasized that this process cannot be rushed or controlled. It follows its own timeline, its own logic. The alchemists understood this, which is why their texts speak of patience, of waiting, of allowing the work to proceed at its own pace. Modern culture, with its demand for immediate solutions and pharmaceutical interventions, struggles profoundly with this reality. We want to fix insomnia, to eliminate it, to return to normal functioning as quickly as possible. But transformative insomnia is not a malfunction to be corrected. It is a process to be honored, a communication to be received, a death to be endured so that rebirth can occur. The clinical implications of this understanding are profound and, frankly, disturbing to conventional medical practice. It suggests that not all insomnia should be treated with sedatives, that some sleeplessness serves a necessary psychological function, that suppressing the symptom may abort a crucial developmental process. This requires discernment, the ability to distinguish between pathological and transformative insomnia, between suffering that serves no purpose and suffering that carries meaning. Jung himself was clear that this distinction is not always easy to make and requires deep psychological understanding, not merely symptom management. When is intervention necessary? When does insomnia signal genuine pathology requiring medical treatment rather than psychological transformation? Jung would say, examine the context. Is this occurring during a major life transition? Is there evidence of psychological conflict, of outdated adaptations breaking down, of new aspects of personality demanding recognition? Is the person in the second half of life facing questions of meaning that cannot be answered by their previous values? If so, the insomnia may be transformative, and the appropriate response is not sedation but psychological work, active engagement with the unconscious material that is preventing sleep. Conversely, if the insomnia appears without psychological context, If it results from anxiety disorders, rumination, or physical illness, then medical intervention is appropriate and necessary. Jung was not opposed to medicine. He was opposed to treating psychological processes as medical problems, to suppressing transformation in the name of symptom relief. The danger, he recognized, is that medication alone, without addressing the underlying psychological need, simply postpones the inevitable. The psyche will find another way to demand attention. The transformation will assert itself through different symptoms, different crises, until it is finally acknowledged and engaged. What Jung discovered, documented across decades of clinical practice and personal experience, was that the sleepless are not broken. They are becoming. Their insomnia is not random suffering, but purposeful process. Not pathology, but transformation. The psyche, in its wisdom, has removed sleep because consciousness must participate fully in its own rebirth, must bear witness to the death of the old self, rather than sleep through it unconsciously. This is the productive function of transformative insomnia, the alchemical work that occurs in the crucible of wakeful nights, the nigredo that precedes all genuine psychological gold.